Hey everyone, welcome back to On-Chain Rust. This is Dom, and in today's video we are going to continue down the path of the Substrate tutorials, and we are going to do the next one in line, which is specifying the origin for a call. Now, to get to the next tutorial, you go to substrate.io, and remember, on the developers menu, just click home, and there's down here under tutorials, dive in, and under work with pallets, there was the add a pallet to the runtime. That's the one we did last time, right? So I just want to show you that the next one in line is, so once we finish the next steps, here is specify the origin for a call. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So in the Nicks Pallet, when we added that to the runtime, there was 4 different functions that we worked with. In fact, we only worked with 3, but there was 4 that were defined. And so the 4 that we're going to talk about today are setName, which associates a account with a nickname and accepts the deposit. ClearName refunds the deposit and clears the name. KillName will remove the name and forfeit the deposit. And ForceName will allow you to set a name without requiring a deposit. It goes without saying that KillName and ForceName are the calls that require root access or root privileges. So the objectives here are, we are going to walk through some of the Nicks Pallet code. We're going to walk through some of the Substrate node template code to see how this is implemented. And then we're going to actually call these functions and observe the results. So we'll call them with different accounts. Some of them will succeed, some of them will fail. And we're going to go see, we're going to observe the events that happen, and we'll walk through and explain what's actually going on. Okay, so if you remember, in the add a pallet to the runtime, we were dealing with the Nicks Pallet, and we had a declaration for the config trait. So in every pallet that gets pulled into the runtime must implement this config trait. And this line right here is the part of the implementation for the Nicks Pallet config, which is the associated type force origin, and there was a concrete type in the frame system crate called ensure root. So let's just jump back over to the previous tutorial and take a look at this, right? So remember, this was our declaration. We had an associated type called force origin. And this associated type, just to recall real quick, associated type you can think of as like a placeholder type for when it's for a concrete type to be implemented later. So basically this is a placeholder, so when you actually write the implementation code, you can actually put a concrete type in its place. And you can specify some trait bounds here. So we're saying that whatever concrete type we use for force origin must implement the ensure origin trait. And ensure origin has a generic parameter, and here we're passing in the self origin value here. So let's take a look at that real quick. So the ensure origin trait is in the frame support crate. It has 4 different functions. We're actually going to be calling this ensure origin function later. And then the descriptions are pretty terse, but here it says it's some sort of check on the origin is performed by this object. So this is actually, this ensure origin function is going to be checking that the calling account has root privileges. And then we also saw here that it's passing in self origin as the parameter. Well, what is self here? Self is the whoever is implementing the config trait, right? And so this config trait is based on the runtime config. So if we look at the runtime config, this is also in the frame system crate under the pallet module. There is a runtime origin type. Now this is pretty new. I think they did just rename this recently. I think it used to be called origin, Now it's called Runtime Origin. This is just about a week ago as of my time recording this. So really what this should say, or what it will probably say at some point, is self runtime origin. But this is the origin we're passing in as the generic parameter. If we go down to the implementation, we can see the line that we just saw in the previous tutorial, which is we are using the ensure root struct in the frame system crate. And if you take a look at the ensure root struct, you can see that it implements the ensure root trait. Right? So these are trait implementations, so it's implementing that. So that's why I was able to compile, and we were all good. If we take a look, going back to our tutorial, one other thing I wanted to show you really quick is if we take a look at the Nicks Pallet code, we took a look a little bit at this last time, but what I want to do is take a look at the implementation of the palette. Right, so we have these different functions. Here's set name, clear name, but here's kill name and force name. Let's take a look at kill name real quick. So kill name, the first line here calls this ensure origin function, right? Force origin, remember, is our force origin type, and we're calling ensure origin. Now what happens here, you have this little question mark in Rust. What that means is it's a little bit of syntactic sugar. So it's saying that, on the call of the function, if there's an error, I want you to propagate that up to the caller. If it's a success result, so that the return type is a result, which can either return a value. It's an enum, and in Rust, enums can hold different values. And so there's two variants of the enum. There's OK and there's error. So if it's OK, that means the function was successful and the execution of the function will continue. You can get the value of whatever stored in that variant if you want to. Or if it's an error, it's actually going to return from the function early and propagate that error up to the caller, right? So if we are not a root user here, it's going to return an error immediately to the caller. If we are a root user, it's going to continue. We're not doing anything with the return value here, so we can ignore that, but normally or sometimes you would see somebody getting this return value, and then this would actually unwrap that value for them so that they could use it later. Okay, now going back to the tutorial, this is what we're doing to make sure that we can ensure that somebody is a root user. So here's what it says. In the development chain specification for the node template, the sudo palette is configured to use the Alice account as the frame system root origin. Okay, so if you were to click on this, it's going to take you to the chain spec code, right, which is this. This is in your Substrate node template under the node source directory. And there's this chain_spec.rs file. And in here, there's different functions defined for different environments. If you remember, we actually launched with the dev parameter. So that would be this function here. And in this function, the first thing we do is get the WASM binary. So remember when we compiled our Rust code, it created a native and a WASM binary. Well, that's this binary. And then it wraps, this is a result. This is what we just got done talking about. So this is the OK variant. So this means that, this would be a successful, we're wrapping the result of this function call in the success variant, which is OK. And you can see here, it's calling this function from Genesis. And there's a bunch of different parameters here. Obviously this is, name development, the ID is dev. There's a enum value here for the chain type, which is development. And then you'll see this fourth parameter here. This fourth parameter is the constructor for the chain. So this is used to create the Genesis block. We can take a look at this real quick. So, what is this chain spec here? Well, chain spec, if you go to the top of this, you'll see that we define chain spec as sc_service generic chain spec. So I already have that open here, and that is this function. I'm sorry, that is this struct. So the description is a configuration of a chain can be used to build a Genesis block. And so here is the from Genesis function, and you can see here the fourth parameter is this constructor, which is a closure. So I'm going to jump back to the code here real quick. And so this test Genesis, that's our function. And I'm sorry, this fourth parameter here is the from Genesis. The fourth parameter is a closure, which is these are in other languages, JavaScript. It's an anonymous function. So this is actually the syntax for the closure, these double pipes and then the brackets. This move keyword, this has to do with Rust's ownership model. So basically we're saying move the ownership of the anonymous function to the function being called. If you're not familiar with Rust ownership, that's a whole nother video in itself, maybe even a series of videos. So go check out the Rust book. You can learn more about that there. But the ownership is what gives Rust some of its safety features, especially when it comes to accessing values in memory, making sure that a value is there, it's not null, you're not overwriting values, those types of things. Some of the things, the problems that you have with C and C++, you don't have with Rust. And it's because, mostly because or partly because of the ownership model. And so I would definitely read up on that, but we're just moving ownership there. Okay, so if you look at this test Genesis function, right? That's what we're calling inside of our anonymous function. So this is calling a function inside the function. And this test Genesis is actually defined down here. And so you can see the different parameters here. And this third parameter here is the root account, right? So you can see that root account, we're getting the ID of Alice, and that's what we're passing in. And so down here, it's configuring the sudo palette to use Alice's account. So that's how we're configuring the sudo palette to use Alice. All right, back to the tutorial. So I just covered all that. And so only Alice can call kill name or force name. Okay, so let's fire up our front end code. If you did the last tutorial, remember we did target release node-template-dev. So that's starting up. Okay, so we got our front end here. I'm going to switch back to the tutorial now. And the first thing we're going to do is set the name for an account, right? So it's saying choose Bob as the active account. So right here, the default is Alice. We're going to choose Bob. And it's saying select the Nicks Pallet. So just like we did last time, we're going to select the Nicks Pallet. We're going to select set name. And we're going to choose a name for the account. Right? So we'll call this Bob Ross. How about Bob Ross? All right. So click signed. All right, so we see the events that pop up here. So we withdraw from the balance, we reserve the deposit for the name is set, we pay the transaction fee, and we're a success. Now this worked because Bob is the owner of the Bob account, so he can set names, he can clear names, right? So I won't actually go over the clear name because it's pretty much the same, so we'll save some time there. But the next thing I want to do is we're going to do the force name. So force name, and we're going to take Charlie's account. Charlie is the target, and we'll say Chucky, okay? And we're going to do, let me clear these events first, and then we're going to do the signed here. All right, so again, we withdrew from our balance. We paid a transaction fee, but it failed. And it failed with a bad origin error. But why did we pay the transaction fee? Well, it says here that the function itself, the function call itself was successful. However, the name reservation can't be completed and a bad origin error is admitted as a result. Why did that happen? Well, if we take a look here, you remember what I said, so force name, we're calling it, so we're entering in the function, we're able to call the function. So we've called the function, this first line is calling ensure origin. Well, Bob is not a account that has access to perform this operation, only Alice. So Bob, this fails, and we propagate the error back up to the caller, and the error in this case is bad origin. So because Bob called the function and Bob used resources, he gets to pay the transaction fee even though the call failed or the transaction failed. So we're going to switch from, I think it has to switch to Alice. Right, let me clear that. Okay, so now with Alice, we're going to do force name. And we're going to use Charlie as the target. And now we're going to use the same value and we're going to do a sudo. Okay, so let's take a look at these. So we withdrew from our balance. We called name force. The sudo was okay. We reserved the deposit. We paid the transaction and it was a success. And now finally, we're going to try kill name. And we're going to do Bob. In fact, this is not going to work because I skipped I skipped the clear name. So let me actually do that real quick. So we'll go back to do clear name. For Bob, and we're going to assign it okay, so yeah, the name was cleared. We unreserved the deposit. The name was cleared. Paid the transaction fee, and it was a success. The reason why I had to do that, and I forgot about this, because this final operation with Alice basically will not work unless Bob doesn't have a name. So again, I went back to Alice here. Alice has the sudo permission. We're going to call kill name. We're going to paste Bob's account. Let me clear these. We're going to call sudo. All right. So we made a withdrawal and sudo failed. Okay. And we still pay the transaction fee. So sudo failed. So what it tells us here is that index 6 error 2. So what does that mean? Well, back over to the tutorial here, if you look at our construct runtime that we used in the last tutorial, we had a bunch of pallets in here. We added the Nicks pallet to the end, right? So index starting at base 0, 6 is the 7th one, which is the Nicks pallet. So it's saying the Nicks pallet failed, and error is 2. Well, what's 2 error? What's the value of 2? It's the unnamed error in the Nicks pallet. Let's take a look at the Nicks pallet code real quick. And here's the error enum. This is 0, starts at 0, so 0, 1, 2, 2 is unnamed, right? So, in fact, let's even look at the code. So we called, it was kill name, right? So kill name. Now what we did was we tried to look up the account, right? So we got this succeeded, and then we went down and we tried to get their deposit or check if they have one, right? And so this okay or error is saying if it's okay, then return the first value, otherwise we need to return an error, right? So again, this is a result, and we are returning the unnamed error. And so that's why we get the value 2 here. So that is it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something about Substrate, you learned something about Rust, and we'll continue with the next tutorial in line. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and like the video if you found it useful, and we'll see you next time.